Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to services to entire businesses. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about autonomous driving and safety. There's been a lot of discussion around whether autonomous driving is safer than human drivers. Is that true? We're going to break it all down for you. All right, good morning, Dee. How are you?
I'm doing good. How you doing?
Quite well today. I have a question right off the bat for you.
All right.
Would you be comfortable sitting in the backseat of an autonomous vehicle and being driven around today?
I would. There's some caveats, right? So autonomous driving right now does better in certain situations than others. So if it's just parking my car, if it's driving on the highway, then I'd feel great. If there's somebody in the front seat somewhere who can take control if absolutely necessary, I would also feel better. But I also know right now where the real challenges are, and a lot of that is kind of the mid-speed driving on surface streets.
Yeah, the thing that actually concerns me a little bit is just other people. And I know that's something that probably is much easier for them to figure out than like changing roads and things like that. But like just people walking around and me being in the back of a vehicle it doesn't have me sitting in the front and controlling it or having the ability to jump in and control it, but just sitting in this vehicle and having it navigate around a city, like it just concerns me like that. What happens if we turn around a corner and someone's on a bike and we hit them? Like, how does that unfold and that kind of stuff? But I know that stuff will get worked out over time. I actually looked up the accident rate for human drivers because I was really curious because everyone keeps talking about this safety issue. And basically there's one death for every 100 million miles driven. And so the question is can we do better with autonomous driving?
Yeah, and I think in theory we absolutely can. I want to add a little caveat to what I said before. If I'm driving around San Francisco in the busiest part of the day, obviously like in a non-COVID world, then if it's a human driver, I'm not completely comfortable.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, right.
Yeah, as you said, you never know when somebody's not going to just like some pedestrian's just going to pop out, or you're going to get cut off by a bicycle, or some Lime scooter is going to try to jump under your wheels. There are situations for sure in crowded cities like that where it's just like, hey, look, this is a little hairy. No matter how you.
Hey, did I ever tell you my New York City story about being in the back of a taxi cab?
You told me a few. I don't think that's the one I'm thinking of, though.
Oh, yeah. So this one is, I've had quite a few strange situations in taxi cabs. But so I was outside I think it's called the Javis Center, and it's the place where they have conferences and everything. And it was like really, really early in the morning, and I had just gone in there and I was helping set up for a booth that we were building for a show that was going on later that week. And I got in the back of this taxi and I was like, oh, you need to take me to this place or whatever. And he's like, oh, okay, cool. So he's driving and I'm not talking. I'm just kind of looking out the window. And we get to the stop sign at the end of the street. And I look over and he's completely asleep. And I had to shake him and wake him up. And I was like, hey, are you okay? And he's like, oh, I'm sorry. I fell asleep. He starts driving about 3 or 4 blocks down. We get stuck in traffic. Boom, falls asleep again. And I shook him again. And I was like, hey, wake up. And he woke up and he was like, oh, I'm sorry. I've been working late or something like that. And I was like, here's your money. I was like, I'm out. And I just got out of the car and left because I was totally freaked out. I'm sitting in the back seat. He's driving. He's falling asleep while he was driving. I feel bad for him. Maybe he was working all night and he was exhausted, but terrified me being in New York City, having someone driving around where there's, a lot of bicyclists and people walking and that kind of stuff. And he fell asleep twice.
I mean, I've definitely had that experience before. I've fallen asleep behind the wheel where, like, I remember one time, I think I was coming to your house. I was coming down 92 from 280 into San Mateo, and I was in heavy traffic, and, it's kind of a windy road. And the next thing I know, I'm getting on the bridge, and I'm like, whoa, that's just like 4 miles of windy traffic area that I don't remember. So apparently I was on some level of autopilot, but there's plenty of, I think everybody has stories like that where you just have to drive when maybe you shouldn't, end up taking some unnecessary risks. But this is ultimately why theoretically autonomous driving can be so much safer than human driving. So number one off the bat, like we're pointing out, all of those impaired driving situations, those are just gone. No more drunk drivers, no more sleepy drivers who are falling asleep, no drivers who probably should have had their vision checked again recently and they can't see quite right. All of those drivers are basically off the road. And then on top of that, there's no distracted driving, right? Because this is an autonomous system that is keeping their eyes on the road at all times. There's no like, oh, I dropped my wallet and I need to grab it. There's no, I'm fiddling with the radio, or I need to see what this text is, or any of that stuff. That's all out the window. Just by definition, people are always saying like, I don't think that this autonomous system can drive more safely than I can. And what I tell them is like, well, don't think about it replacing you as a driver. Think about all the other drivers that you run into on the road that are just unsafe or don't know what they're doing. And imagine they're replaced with something that's more capable. Because by definition, this would basically eliminate millions of below average skilled drivers from the road. That's probably millions of drivers at this point. You just take those people who aren't very safe or don't know what they're doing off the road and replace them with something that's minimally competent.
I think that's hard for us to imagine, because when we get behind the wheel and we start driving, there's so many scenarios that present themselves where we go, oh my gosh, if I wasn't, looking over here, or for example, when the window gets fogged up and you're looking out, you have to look out the side window to make sure that you can see going down the street. And because of that, you choose to pull over. And there's just so many things that come up. You go, is it possible for the people developing these systems to account for all those potentials that could come up when driving on just a normal day?
Well, there's one thing. So there's advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk about all those. One of the big things is just from an awareness standpoint, humans are terrible at awareness, right? They're terrible at surveillance. They're terrible at staying alert and staying in a high state of readiness for long periods of time, especially when they're being surrounded by 99% safe environment, right? And they can also really only attend to one or two things at the same time. You can only really look at one thing at a time. But for these autonomous systems, they have 360 vision. They can see everything that's going on around them. They can react more quickly than a human driver can. And they're not going to get lulled into this, complacency or false sense of security because for the past, 10 years, they've never been in a car accident. And they feel like they're in a very safe space. They're always going to be at that high level of readiness. The other thing that I wanted to point out that I think can't be understated the importance of is the ability for autonomous vehicles to communicate with each other. So for us, we have hand signals, we have, turn indicators, we have brake lights, we have things that let drivers around us know what we're going to do. And we hope that they're paying attention and see that we're going to do that. And they're also not going to decide for whatever reason to not let us do it. Like they're not going to refuse to yield the right of way so that we can't make our turn or get over a lane. But for these vehicles, they can communicate with each other directly through ad hoc communication systems, whether that's Bluetooth, whether that's any other kind of wireless communication system. And that vehicle can tell the other vehicle behind it, hey, I'm about to brake in 0.5 seconds. Or, hey, I'm about to come over. Or I'm going to make this turn. All of those things that can take us by surprise if they're communicating directly with each other. All these vehicles know what every other vehicle is going to do.
I love that. But the thing is that as we move from human drivers only to autonomous driving vehicles, and eventually, let's say the majority of vehicles in 20 years or 30 years are autonomous vehicles on the road, we're going to have that midpoint. And that midpoint is you're going to have half autonomous vehicles and half human drivers, right? So I look at it and I go, well, the autonomous vehicles are just going to follow the rules to a T.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're going to look at it and they're going to say, oh, okay, I'm supposed to make a right here at 15 miles per hour. I'm going to use the camera to kind of double check. I pause for a moment just in case something comes into camera view, things like that. I almost would say that I'm more worried in a situation like that being the human driver than I am in the autonomous vehicle, because the autonomous vehicle follows a set of rules. I mean, this is essentially what happens every time they develop something at Disneyland, right? Because it's in a closed ecosystem, you can make the system perfect. You can make it so that cars never bump into each other. Everything's always, perfect. If there's a maintenance issue, it reports it right away. All those different things. And then the second we exit a situation like what you see at Disneyland and you try to apply it to the real world, there's a lot of scenarios that come up that were maybe not fully thought through, right? And that's the stuff that's happening right now, is like people are really trying to figure out all of those challenges and how do we take those challenges and apply them to the system, the development of the system, the AI. So did you do any research on like the training of AI and kind of like what people are thinking about?
Yeah. So right now, what's going on is they need to get data into the AI system so that the AI systems can kind of learn how to deal with a variety of different situations. For the most part, the software is together, the hardware is together. Like there's probably obviously going to be some software and hardware enhancements as we go forward. But right now, what the software needs to do is learn how to deal with all these different kinds of situations. One of the challenges is how do you know and how do you also expose the AI system to real world situations that just don't happen very often, right? So you have, for example, some unusual weather conditions like sleet or lightning flashes that can blind the sensors for a while, or ash covering sensors because of like wildfires locally. I learned about a type of weather event that I'd never heard of before. I was watching a football game. It's something called a grapple. And it's apparently like this weird mid space between, it's not quite sleet, it's not quite hail. It's almost like there's like these ice balls that get covered in sleet and they freeze. So it's almost, they call it like soft hail. I had never heard of it before, but it exists. And how do you train a vehicle to deal with that? You could probably try to simulate it, but it's not going to be the same thing as actually dealing with it on the road. The road conditions aren't going to be quite the same. There's a variety of things you can't quite account for. The other thing is, how do you account for unusual, like human behavior, like pedestrian behavior? Like maybe you're out on the crowded streets, people going crazy and celebrating after their NBA team won the championship, right? So everybody's out in the streets and you're trying to figure your way through this crowd without hitting anybody. How do you train an AI system to deal with that when you can't really create that situation right now? You would basically need for an event like that to happen when people can do that without having to worry about COVID, and then place your autonomous vehicle in that situation to help learn with a driver and find a way to do that in a safe and ethical way without putting anybody in danger. So all of that is very difficult. And one of the real challenges with training AI is they have difficulty with situations they aren't trained to. So a lot of times they're just not good at improvising in order to deal with something unforeseen, right? A lot of times they'll just freeze up. That's one of the things we saw with some of the higher profile accidents that happened. They encountered a situation where they couldn't interpret what was going on because of what their senses were receiving. They didn't know how to respond to that. So they took no action and ended up like going full speed into the back of a truck or something, right? That's something that humans can deal with because humans are much better at improvising in that moment because they're generalizing from previous stimuli and training into a new situation. But for AI, they have a much more difficult time dealing with it. So those are some of the things that they have to deal with in training. And even after training, when you get into situations where you're on like city streets, for example, there's so much about humans in the environment that even if all the other cars are autonomous, or most of the other cars are autonomous, you still have unpredictable human behavior. Who's going to walk out in front of my car? Who's going to open their car door into my lane? Who's going to, fall down or whatever it happens to be that now this vehicle has to respond to in the moment. So these are all challenges that the AI has to learn how to deal with.
Yeah. And, I'll tell you, I was listening to, I remember thinking about all these things and going like, wow, like this is a big challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to a discussion with Elon Musk. And one of the things that he pointed out, which for some reason totally clicked after he said it, is he said, the difference between like human, and I'm kind of summarizing here, but like the difference between like the human driving and learning curve over time and and potentially for AI, is that AI is only going to get better. And so what he was saying is like, let's say, let me give a good example. So let's say you're in the middle of an area that has a lot of snow, like Wisconsin or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a car, autonomous vehicle slides off the side of the road and hits the embankment because something happened and it learned from it. It's not going to just absorb that data for that car and cars in that area. It will upload that data to the database for all cars that are autonomous.
This is true.
So even if your car is in California, it's going to get that data point. So if one day there happens to be ice or snow on the ground, the car will know how to manage it because it learned from another car that was in a completely different state. So over time, it's going to get safer and safer and safer and safer and safer and safer. Where with human drivers, we don't pass that information down to one another very often, right? They
And
may
not
add
necessarily in a
something to the
reliable way
training.
either. Yeah.
Not in a reliable way. Yeah, we basically put it in these books and we're like, oh yeah, you should read these books, or oh, you should go to this, was it called defensive driving school so you can learn how to drive in rain and things like that. Those are not great ways to teach everyone how to handle challenging situations in bad weather.
Mm-hmm.
But if one car deals with it in New York City or Wisconsin, California is going to also get that data. And I love that. I think that right there is just amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real powers of this system, because if you think about, you can have a very experienced, very skilled driver who is then put into some kind of emergency situation on the road where they end up slamming on the brakes and start sliding. A automated system isn't going to do that. They're not going to overreact. They're not going to make a mistake once they know what the correct action is. They're just going to respond kind of dispassionately in the correct way based on their training. The other thing is that humans, if you think about how a human learns how to drive, it takes a lot of practice. And the AI systems, once they're fully mature, once they learn how to deal with a certain situation, they're just going to apply that. They're not going to forget what they've learned. There's a factor in human factors psychology, and we learned this from when we were working at NASA, is that sometimes when somebody learns a certain way of doing something, like if you're in an aircraft and throttling up or moving the throttle forward makes the aircraft throttle up or versus going downwards, and then you swap those control mechanisms in a tense situation, you can have what's called reversion to first learned, where if you learned one configuration of an interface and then you learn another one in a tense situation, you can just automatically revert to that previous one. That can happen if you're shifting on a manual stick shift, and you learned on a European vehicle that has the configuration one way, and then you switch to another one, to an American configuration later. You could end up shifting incorrectly in a tense situation because you're going back to what you learned the first time.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And actually, I can think of a real world scenario. So I don't know if you remember, but about 10 years ago, you and I were in your car and we were heading to a meeting, and we were in San Jose, and we were driving on a road where we were going north and then the traffic was going south, but there was a whole bunch of streets to the west. Mm-hmm. And as we were driving down this road, someone was coming up to the stop sign at one of those streets. And what they have to do is they have to look left, see how the traffic is, and then they just kind of merge into the traffic. Mm-hmm. The person just drove right through the stop sign, directly into our traffic. And the car was coming right at your side. And instead of you swerving left, which would have put us in oncoming traffic, in that moment, you pulled to the right and your car slid. I mean, what were we, like 12 inches away from that car? I mean, but you basically avoided the accident by going the opposite direction that I would imagine that most people would pull the car into. Most people would say, oh no, there's a car coming to me from the right. I got to move to the left. But instead, you quickly looked and saw all the cars coming from the left and pulled your car to the right. Now, imagine if that was an autonomous vehicle. It would have looked and analyzed at that situation. It would have analyzed the data and said, I can't go left because there's oncoming traffic. I can only go right. And if I go right into that vehicle that's coming towards me, I have to pull the steering wheel deeply to the right to make
Mhm.
sure that I don't run into it, and also look up and make sure there's no humans walking around or people riding bicycles, right? That was a very, very tricky situation that you got us out of, thankfully. But like, I imagine that most people would have ended up in an accident, but for whatever reason, your brain just said, I got to do this, and you
Yeah.
did it. And that
And
data would have been sent up, and everyone would have that data.
yeah, and that's the a kind of spatial reasoning that needs to occur in that instance of realizing, okay, if I accelerate and move over to the right, then I can get myself out of danger. If I go left, I'm going into incoming traffic. If I stay where I am, this person's going to hit me. So not everybody's going to be able to do that in the moment. Like you said, a lot of people are just going to reflexively be like, I'm going to move the most direct path out of this danger, but I'm going to put myself as a result into other danger. So that's definitely something that a system can do. That kind of spatial reasoning can do much faster than a human being on a reliable sense. Because for me, I can't even guarantee that I would have recognized that that was the right thing to do 9 times out of 10. I might have just gotten lucky in that moment, and another
Yeah.
day I might have gotten hit.
That's true. Yeah. And we talk about all this stuff basically in the perfect setup, the perfect scenario where everything is functioning all the time and there's
Yeah,
no issues or whatever. But what about software problems, right? What about glitches and bugs and software updates and hackers, right?
yeah.
That whole side of it has to be completely robust, right? Like you cannot have issues in that area.
Yeah, so for glitches and bugs, there are things they can do to ensure that any kind of glitch or bug that could create a safety situation is minimized as much as possible. It's just like extra testing. So they can exert that level of testing in order to make sure that happens. In our modern kind of internet driven environment, we feel like that doesn't necessarily happen as much because people know that they can just throw out something buggy and then fix it as they go along, right? But for vehicles, that's a different story. I think the biggest the biggest concern from a software standpoint is cybersecurity. It is like, I don't want somebody hacking my car and taking control of it, or just tracking me and knowing where I'm going, or confusing my car and end up being lost or something. Those are things that they are going to be a little bit more difficult to figure out because there's an active human mind on the other side of it trying to circumvent your countermeasures that you're putting out there. But for the
True.
most
And
part,
I
I
would
think they'll get it
imagine
figured out.
that, yeah, and I would imagine that the systems that are built into the car are going to have a lot of data that is stored in them at all times. So even if the internet goes down or some strange command comes in that's not normal, that kind of stuff, you can build out a kind of robust redundancy system that would at least get the car to safety. Like, oh, a strange command just came in, so I'm going to pull the car over to the side of the road and
Mm-hmm.
wait and contact the cybersecurity expert at X company, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there are so many things that you can do, I think, to prevent that from happening. I do wonder about overrides. So, for example, if you're sitting in the back of an autonomous vehicle and something happens and you need to get away or whatever, I don't know what it is. Maybe a mob of people are trying to get in your car. I don't know. Can you somehow get in the front of the car and just drive off? Can you lock all the doors for safety? I mean, there's so many questions about things that can happen.
Well, I think this is the immediate future for the foreseeable future. There's going to be a human override option. I think maybe down the line when people get super comfortable with it, maybe they'll take that away. I don't think that's the best idea in the world. But once we get to a couple generations down the road and humans barely even know how to drive anymore, maybe that's not as important.
Yeah.
Like, I just keep thinking about, I know this is a little weird. I keep thinking about Knight Rider and Kit, and like, I just keep asking myself, what would Kit do in this situation?
Yeah, it's true. It's a great question. And you know what? You have a background in philosophy and ethics and stuff. So you and I are always having these very philosophical conversations about topics like, what to do if X happens, and then Y happens, and that kind of stuff. And I saw that you had sent over this question to me that said, for example, do you swerve to miss a pedestrian if it could mean crashing into a school bus? Right?
Yes.
These are really big, hard questions that have to be answered, right?
Hmm.
So you can look at the system from a simplistic standpoint. You could say, no, there's 27 people on a bus and there's one on the street. It's not that simple, though. For example, maybe if you bumped into a school bus, nothing will happen to any of the kids in these one of these big, huge school buses. Maybe you're only going 15 miles per hour. But if you run into a pedestrian going 15 miles per hour, they could seriously get hurt.
Hmm.
So who's going to make those decisions, right?
Well, this is one of the ethical challenges with when it comes to autonomous driving, because when this happens in the real world, you're kind of reflexive, you're kind of reacting, you're not necessarily freezing time and making a choice as far as what to do. When it comes to autonomous driving, and these systems are now being programmed with algorithms that set rules as far as what kind of action they're going to take. It basically is a situation where those programmers are freezing time and making a choice as far as what to do in that situation. For anybody who's in philosophy, this is basically the trolley problem, right? Do you let the trolley continue what it's doing and let it hit 5 people, or do you pull the lever to switch rails so you only hit 2 people? So there isn't an easy answer for it. It's one of the reasons why it's a famous question. And I don't necessarily know the answer to it, but I know that the people who are developing these systems, they absolutely have to deal with these, and there isn't a good answer for it. And they're probably going to, eventually the situation will come up where they're going to have to speak to why they did what they did. And
True.
from a societal standpoint, we're going to have to figure out what to do about it. So one thing I'll point out before we move on, because I think the ethical challenges are kind of related to this, is all of this time that we spent under kind of COVID quarantine and the economy shut down or partially shut down, it has really kind of slowed down the development of these AI systems because they can't train in naturalistic situations as much anymore. So if you are think about what it's been like to drive under COVID and how much there's much less traffic and there's fewer pedestrians on the road and all these other things, it's creating an unnatural environment that the AI software can't learn from. And it's also kind of to some extent avoiding a lot of these kind of ethical concerns coming up because people are safely indoors. So I think that this situation is slowing everything down as far as getting the AI trained and fully ready, and it's extending those deadlines out, and it's making it a little bit more difficult to figure out what the answers really are because we can't really address the questions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And something else also came up the other day that I wanted to bring up to you. We were talking to a family, and they were saying that their kids are both, I think they're like 16, one of them's 17, and they're not interested in getting their driver's license at all. And I started doing a little research on this, and apparently this is very common now. And it's because of Uber and Lyft that they don't feel the need to actually learn how to drive.
Mm-hmm.
So I almost feel like this is the first step toward the autonomous vehicle movement, because if this younger generation is looking at it going, wait a minute, I can grab my phone and I can click come pick me up and it costs me $3 to go see my friend. And then it'll come pick me up and take me back home at the end of the night. Why would I go through this whole lengthy and expensive process of learning how to drive, buying a car, paying for insurance, paying for maintenance, storing the car, blah, 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 blah. Right. And I almost feel like this is kind of the canary in a coal mine of the future may have a lot of people who just don't know how to drive, and they only use things like Uber, Lyft, and autonomous vehicles in order to get around. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just what the future looks like.
Well, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of that practice. I feel personally like it's a bit irresponsible, and it is also like most of the younger people I know who are kind of in that situation are people who are spending their parents' money on Uber and Lyft, and it's not like they're paying for it themselves. It's also kind of commoditizing other people's labor in a way that I don't think is the most responsible. Where everybody is like, I know that creates more business for Uber and Lyft drivers, but at the same time, it kind of takes them for granted in a weird way. So it will be difficult if we're trying to move to autonomous vehicles and you have somebody in the vehicle who's not capable of taking over and getting the car to safety if there's some kind of a failure. So
It's true.
it's a concern, especially in the short term, before these systems are fully ready to deal with these situations. It is kind of like, all right, well, what happens if you are driving your system is driving along, your automated Uber is driving you somewhere, and a bunch of mud gets splashed on their sensors, or a sensor fails in the middle of it, and the system says, okay, I can't autonomously drive anymore, you have to take over, and that person can't do it. So
Yeah. No,
they're
it's
just
true.
stranded now.
When I explained this to my dad, actually, he said, "Well, what about that situation where you're out with your friends or something happens and you have to drive someone else's car to help get them home, or the other million scenarios that could come up? I
Hmm.
think you should learn how to drive, even if you don't do it that often."
Yeah, I feel like I mean, come on. Learning how to drive is almost a sense of civic duty because even if you aren't going to drive your own car, you might be called upon to help somebody else at some point. So I think that it's kind of, I know a lot of people who grew up like in New York, for example, who never got their driver's license. And I'm like, come on, it's not that hard. It's a basic human skill. It's like learning how to boil pasta. Just learn how to do it. Just do it.
Yeah. Well, hey, one of the things I wanted to address was I don't know if people know this, but there's actual levels of autonomy that have already been established for these vehicles. The Society of Automotive Engineers had established these, and they were adopted basically by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And there's 5 total levels, and I want to go through each one real quickly, just so you understand how people are thinking about autonomous vehicles. So level 0 is basically the human driver does all the driving. So there's no autonomous actions being taken. Level 1 is an advanced driver assisted system is in the vehicle and can sometimes assist the driver with either steering or braking or accelerating, but not both at the same time. But then when you move from level 1 to level 2, it's basically the same, but you can actually control both steering and braking and accelerating simultaneously under some circumstances. So it's like you have a little bit of autonomous stuff going on there, but only under certain circumstances. When you transition to level 3, which is kind of what we're seeing now, it's an automated driving system on the vehicle, and it can perform all aspects of driving under some circumstances. So basically, it has all the skills there, but it's only allowed to be used, let's say, on the highway or in areas of low density or things like that. Then you get into level 4, and that's an autonomous driving system that can perform all driving tasks and monitor the driving environment. So it has all the cameras and everything to monitor the environment and drive for you. Okay. And then when you get to level 5, and that's like the ultimate goal for all these companies building these things, the definition is an automated driving system on the vehicle that can do all the driving in all circumstances. The human occupants are just passengers. So there's these 5 levels. You can look them up. They're readily available online, but it kind of shows you where we're at. And right now we're kind of in that transition of level 3 where it can perform stuff, but only under certain circumstances, and level 4 where it can do it all, but you have to monitor it and you have to have someone kind of watching it while that's happening. And for us to get from level 4 to level 5, I think that's the big leap. Like that's requires like approvals from the government, approvals from different city councils, things like that, to agree that they want to have these vehicles in the system, and also that we have redundancy in the system to kind of protect pedestrians and others who are driving their normal vehicles on the road.
Yeah, so I think conceptually you can think of kind of level 1 and level 2 as kind of these lane assist and kind of collision avoidance systems that are fairly common in cars now. Level 3 is a little bit more like GM's Super Cruise or Tesla's Autopilot, where it's doing most or all of the driving in certain situations that are pretty easy to deal with. So like driving on the highway, because there's not going to be pedestrians on the road. Nobody's going to be stopping suddenly. There are certain assumptions about the rules that they deal with pretty well. It's when you get into kind of level 4, level 5, where it's things like driving on complex city streets with pedestrians everywhere and animals, and narrow streets where cars can pull out at any given time, or blind corners, things like that. Those are the hardest things to deal with, and that's kind of what these AI systems are currently addressing. But as things get better, as more information becomes available, as there are more autonomous cars on the road, that will get easier. So, for example, when it comes to like a blind corner, I mentioned before the communication systems. If you are approaching a blind corner, but there's another automated car who has a better viewpoint, that other automated vehicle can wirelessly communicate the situation, establishing situational awareness for your vehicle, even though your vehicle doesn't have a clear line of sight on what might be around that corner.
So to kind of wrap things up here today, I wanted to do a prediction, but I want to do a prediction on where we both think this is going to unfold first. So we both talked in the last episode how we think this is going to happen within 10, 15 years, But I'm curious from your perspective, what area do you think is going to see these level 4, level 5 autonomous vehicles driving around first? Is it going to be like the San Francisco Bay Area, or is it going to be big wide open spaces like in Texas? Like, what are your thoughts?
I think it's going to be the big wide open spaces. I think it's specifically going to be the large shipping trucks, the semi trucks that drive around on open roads for hours at a time. Like if you imagine for us, if you're driving on Highway 5 from Los Angeles to Sacramento, there's huge stretches of straight line driving for these vehicles. So it's one of the easiest things to automate. It's actually economically, it makes the most sense because you can automate a lot of that driver out of the equation in a way that saves that company quite a bit of money, or just makes that driver much more efficient. So instead of maybe that one driver managing one vehicle, maybe they can manage multiple vehicles, or maybe they can take more breaks, or they can do something in between. There's, I think that's both from an economic standpoint and from a just a logistics standpoint for the software, it's probably going to be what we're going to see first.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I actually was thinking like Texas, Arizona, places like that is where we'll actually see them in action and kind of just doing their job on a daily basis. But I think cities like New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, LA, things like that, you're going to see a lot of that level 3, level 4 happening in order to gather data. Right? They want to get all this data. So you're going to see a lot of testing in those areas, but you're going to see a lot of freedom of autonomous vehicles in big, wide open areas.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be great. And I also think that it's going to be really exciting to kind of see how this unfolds, especially in the next 5 years, as everyone pushes super, super hard to start getting the system up and running.
Yeah. I feel like when it comes to autonomous driving becoming mainstream, the last places you're going to see them are in kind of the very dense Eastern style cities. And if you think about driving around in like Manhattan, that has its own challenges, but it's mostly a grid. It's pretty flat. Now you apply it to San Francisco, where the roads are much more confusing, and you have these massive hills to deal with. Also, I think that to some extent is like the final frontier for autonomous driving.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, man. This was a really exciting episode, and I'm hoping that everybody loves this. So we will see you all next week for our next episode.
Bye.